To make real food, you need a great recipe, passed down from generation to generation. Welcome to Real Food, Real Kitchens, the show that goes into real kitchens of everyday people to tell the story of a dish and the families and cultures that bring it to life.
This is my real kitchen, real family, and real recipes for Low Country Carolina pulled pork, Carolina coleslaw, and Low Country barbecue sauce for pulled pork.
You can get this recipe and many more by visiting realfoodrealkitchens.com.
Hi, I'm Bart Smith.
And I'm Mark Yelenich. Got a story about Bart and I really meeting and getting into this competition. It's a common friend, and a friend of mine that I go fishing with, Billy Kirkland, has a boat that he keeps behind Bart's house. And one evening, Billy was telling me that his friend Bart likes barbecue. And so I brought Bart a rack of ribs one time, and sometime after that I told Billy that we were going, my wife and I were going to Maine, and Billy said, "You should call Bart while you're up there and go see him." And I didn't really pay any attention to it because I didn't really know Bart that well. But after about 3 times of Billy encouraging me to call Bart, I did. And I'm really glad I did, because when we got up there, he treated us like family, entertained my wife and I for the day. He was going to take us out on the boat. The weather didn't quite cooperate, but it was just the kindness that he showed someone that just randomly gave him a rack of ribs. So you never know what a rack of ribs will do for you, or a common friend. So here we are a few months later. The day before, I go and buy a case of ribs, which is 18 racks of ribs, and I bought 2 cases of chicken breasts. So the day before, I'll just open all the packages. I do as many racks as I can at a time, which is 18 racks. So that's what I'm doing today. I've used a lot of different seasonings over the years, over probably the last 30 years. But what I really come back to is this Texjoy steak seasoning. It's really all I use anymore. I use it on really everything I cook. Hamburgers, steak, these barbecue ribs. Cover them pretty liberally. You can see what's in the cooler there on how much of the spice I put on them. I put a lot of it on there the day before, and then I'll pack the ribs away in a cooler overnight with a bag of ice in the bottom to keep them cold. And I really just sprinkle it on. I don't really rub it in. And that seems to work great. Put them away for the night, and then it'll be ready for the next morning when I get the smoker going. Just going to do these last 2 here. The underside is really more of a silver skin stuff. A lot of people take this off. I really never have, and never had any complaints about it being on there. It's just as you're eating the rib, you know, you pull it off yourself, and there's not much reason to put the seasoning on this underside skin. And I will put that ribs down when I put it on the smoker. You'll see that in a little bit. And I'll just pack those away for the night, let them sit, and they'll be ready to go tomorrow. When I smoke meat, like today, I smoked 18 racks of ribs, and right now I have 60 chicken breasts on the smoker at one time. So I can do a lot of meat, but I like to give it away. And where I live, there's not a lot of barbecue. I moved down to Southwest Florida from Arkansas, and so when anybody gets some good barbecue down here, they really seem to like it a lot. I just enjoy giving it away to where people enjoy it. If somebody just comes back and says, "Those ribs are really good," you know, that's all I like from it. For this smoker, I use logs of wood, and so the best way I find to get them on fire and start to smoke and burn is to use a chimney. One of the chimneys, you can really get them anywhere. They're easy to use. These are the grates that the fire is going to rest on, so I'm going to dump that charcoal on the bottom of this or on top of this, and then I'll put the logs on it to get the fire going. I've got a few different varieties of wood here. I've got some orange wood. I live down in Southwest Florida, so really you find what's available where you are. Use some citrus here. There's something known as buttonwood. That's a good wood to use. Never used sea grape, but been told you could use that. In Arkansas where I used it, I would use hickory and primarily pecan. And I do have some pecan here that a friend of mine brought me from Georgia that I'll be using also. So primarily today, I'm going to use the orange wood and the pecan. Right now I want the fire to get going a little bit, which it will with it open like it is. It won't take long, so we'll be putting the meat on here in just a minute, sealing it down and just monitoring the temperature for the next 4 or 5 hours. You can already see how it's already catching the logs on fire. The amount of time it takes depends on the temperature you use, so I'm going to want mine to probably smoke and get that smoke flavor on the ribs for about 3.5 to 4 hours at 225 to 250. At that point, then I'll wrap them in aluminum foil. I'll leave them on the smoker another hour, which they'll begin to kind of steam inside that bag, and it really tenderizes them. So we're just going to load the smoker. Like I said earlier, this silver skin side is going to go down. So the rib here, that's down, and what I believe is as this smokes and gets hot, that fat starts to render down and it'll seep through the rib meat, and that skin kind of holds it in there to where it'll really tenderize and soften it up, especially after I put it in the aluminum foil after about 3.5 hours on the smoker. So here we go. Two racks I'll need to cut in half just for the way the length of the rack is to get them in between the pairs of 4. But that way I can get a full 18 racks of ribs on here at one time. Now when I place the racks of ribs on the smoker, I don't really want them to touch. That way as they smoke, they're going to get that good bark on the outside. And if they were touching one another or on top of each other, they wouldn't get any of that smoke flavor built into the meat. So that's it. I'm going to close it down, and then I'm just going to try to get the temperature to 225 to 250, and she'll be good to go.
I was raised up predominantly in Aiken County, South Carolina, out in the country. We became associated at a very early age with barbecue, pit-cooked barbecue in South Carolina. And of course, being in that part of the country, it was a natural to be involved in the cooking of the pork. The ground would be scooped out, and there would be a frame built above it, generally chicken wire and rebar rods to hold the pig. And then you'd build a fire over to the side of that pit and shovel the coals under the pig. And that would go on for many, many hours. Generally, it would be an overnight experience, 20 hours or more to do the complete job. Frankly, as a young person, I didn't enjoy that too much and swore that if I ever grew up, I'd never cook another pig again. So here I am doing it. But one of the things I like about today's process is the fact that I have a mechanical device out in the yard which affords me an opportunity to cook the pig over a controlled fire. So first we'll start with the basic ingredient, which is distilled vinegar, just white vinegar. I'm going to use 2½ cups. This entire recipe will make about 1 quart of sauce. So we're going to put in 2½ cups of distilled vinegar. We're going to use a little ketchup. This is about 1/4 cup of ketchup. It's mainly just for color. There's no ketchup taste to this at all. Again, the predominant taste is going to be the vinegar and the pepper. We'll use some sweetener as well. We put a little brown sugar in and a little white sugar, not much. To further sweeten it, we'll add a cup of apple juice. And of course, salt, and salt to taste. I use about 2 tablespoons. Additionally, to spike the flavor, some Tabasco sauce. In this case, I'm using about 1.5 teaspoons. Some people will use 3 teaspoons, some people will use 1, again, to taste. To further spike it, we have some red pepper and some black pepper, again, to taste. And then what we want to do is take these ingredients to a boil, let them simmer briefly, and we have a low country, South Carolina, vinegar-based barbecue sauce, which is a perfect combination with pulled pork. I happened to come by this recipe from an old friend of mine who worked in one of the popular barbecue spots in South Carolina, and he was much older than I was at the time, and he could not divulge the recipe. And unfortunately, Jimmy got sick and called me up, and we discussed it, and he agreed that in his condition, he didn't need to worry about the job. He had bigger worries than his job, and he shared with me before he died this recipe, and I agreed I would not divulge the recipe. I've shared with you the ingredients. You can amend the quantities of those ingredients to suit yourself. I think that you'll find this to be a very unique sauce for barbecue. It is entirely different than what most of you have been accustomed to when you think about barbecue sauce. When it is served on the meat, this sauce, unlike some of the other sauces that you might be familiar with when you're thinking about barbecue ribs or perhaps a Boston butt or a shoulder, for pulled pork, normally, particularly in the low country, this would be a dipping sauce rather than a sauce that you'd apply when you're cooking. We cook the meat totally clean. We don't have any thing on the meat except hickory wood that we cook with, and we generally use pure hickory wood. Sometimes we might sweeten the hickory with a little apple or a little cherry, but ordinarily it's straight hickory. The chemistry between the hickory and the pork and the vinegar, you can't beat it. One of the dishes that complement the pulled pork dish is coleslaw. It also derives its name from its geographic origin. They call it low country Carolina coleslaw. It's a vinegar-based coleslaw and is very distinctly different from the more commonly known mayonnaise-based coleslaws. My grandmother was the type of Southern cook who loved what she did. She stayed in the kitchen for extended periods of time. Her greatest joy in life, I think, was probably feeding her family and seeing the results, hearing them talk about how wonderful the food was, and it was really good. She's the first person that I remember making this coleslaw. Now, first ingredient is cabbage, whole head of cabbage, green pepper, sweet onion, 2 or 3 carrots. And what we do is we take these vegetables and we chop them up And we do it very finely. We want to make sure, if you can get a close-up here, you have some idea that this is one of the things that constitutes the difference between the Carolina barbecue coleslaw and the coleslaw you might find in a supermarket someplace, which ordinarily will have a mayonnaise base. This will have a vinegar base. Once again, just like the barbecue sauce, it'll be a vinegar base. This complements the pork, and you'll always find the coleslaw served with the pork. So when I was growing up, my grandmother used to make this slaw, and this is hand cut. That's what she did. She insisted that if you used a blender or a food processor, you dry out the vegetables. So she cut it all by hand. And I haven't been able to get over the guilt of using a food processor, so I also cut it by hand. And when you do all of these vegetables by hand, if you're quick, you might be able to get it done in an hour. It generally takes me about an hour and 15 minutes to do it. And this coleslaw, again, is cut very finely and is then placed in a vinegar-based marinade or a vinegar-based sauce, and you put it in the refrigerator and let it sit for at least 6 hours. And you'll find, actually, that the next day it's even better, and the second day it's even better. At the time, there were no food processors. At least in my grandmother's kitchen, there were no food processors. So things were done by hand. And even with her skill in the kitchen, it still took her a long time. I remember as a child that she would stand there for quite a while, chopping up all the vegetables. Okay, now what we're going to do, we're going to combine all this into a mixing bowl. Here's our sweet onion. And then carrot, a little color. And lastly, the green pepper, a little more color. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take our sauce, again a vinegar-based sauce, and we're going to pour it over our coleslaw, and then we're going to toss that completely and put it in the refrigerator for at least 6 hours, covered. They're really two totally different efforts, two totally different, I think, barbecues. The ribs are really an entirely different recipe than the pulled pork, so there's not really any competition between us there. Right. And I'm delighted that Mark does the ribs, because the ribs are a little tough product to produce. The pulled pork is pretty easy, just takes a lot of patience. I think Mark and I both would have to admit that were we back in the days when we were much younger and we were having to cook this on an open fire someplace out back rather than on a mechanized computer control device almost, it would be much more taxing than it is today. This is the finished product. This is started out as about a 30-pound ham, and we have taken about 20 hours to cook this ham. We cook it at about 220 degrees Fahrenheit over a hickory fire. Very slow, takes a lot of patience. I guess there are three things that I would say about pulled pork. The first thing is you have to start with absolutely the best meat that you can get. There's no way to make a tasty meal out of meat that's not good quality meat. So we start with the best hams that we can find. And I use hams rather than shoulders or butts because there's far more lean meat in the ham. So from a 30-pound ham like this, we will get about 15 pounds of pulled pork, of lean meat. The second thing after the meat is the patience. You just have to take your time. You can't rush this process. Again, 220 degrees, and it's going to take you about 20 hours to do a 30-pound ham. If you get a bigger piece of meat, if you've got wind or cold weather that you're cooking in, that's going to affect the time. And the third thing, of course, is the sauce, which we've already talked about. We're going to take it apart, and you can see that it just almost falls apart. This is the pulled pork. This is what we've been after. And we just take all of the gristle, take all of the fatty tissue that's left, any bone, and discard that so that we have nothing left but lean pork. See, that bone is pretty clean, cooked down to nothing. Got a lot of skin here. Some folks insist that they like to cook with the skin on the upper side. I do it the other way because I like to keep the juice in the pig skin that cooks in the skin. You can see a lot of this fat here that renders the meat, renders flavor to the meat, and it's also one of the things that keeps the meat so incredibly moist. So this is just, as you can see, it just falls apart. Again, pulled pork. Again, you can see how moist and how tender and how lean this meat is. One of the things that's really delicious, if you can see where it's a little scorched on the outside, that is a very kind of a bacon-like flavor. It's delicious. Again, there's no sauce on this. The real chemistry here is between the hickory wood, the smoke, and the pork itself. Some of the other dishes that my grandmother made, everything was, of course, all the vegetables were fresh, and a lot of greens, mustard greens, kale, collard greens, cornbread, homemade biscuits, oftentimes cornbread and biscuits at the same sitting. She made a terrific deep dish peach cobbler, what we call deep dish peach pie, and a deep dish apple. My wife today has copied those, and she may have improved somewhat on those recipes. I think when you get away from it and you realize that, wow, something's missing, I'd like to go back and recreate some of those dishes. That's hard to do. I can still remember my grandmother making these deep dish pies and serving them warm with ice cream. It was just heavenly.
Join us next time on Real Food, Real Kitchens, when we'll tell the story of a new dish and the family and culture that bring it to life. Thank you for watching Real Food, Real Kitchens. You can get this recipe and many more by visiting realfoodrealkitchens.com.
My wife's favorite is the sauce that Bart makes. It's really incredible. I'm encouraging him to pass it down, not let it pass with him, but pass it down.
Well, I didn't think that was that close to the end, Mark.